3 years ago, I started learning how to drive. Now, my parents, being cruel, decided not to put me into a normal vehicle, but into a stick-shift vehicle. Now, I thought that I was going to be like all the other kids and get to drive and do all the fun things that older teenagers get to do. But that I got into the car and I could not make it move. The topic that I've drawn today is a ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. This phrase, this quote, is exactly true. And we'll be talking about why this is true and why it's relevant to our lives through 3 different points. First, we're going to talk about it in our individual lives. Second, we're going to talk about that this principle remains true from a societal context. And finally, we're going to look at it and how it relates to our relationship with God. So first of all, let's jump into that first point, which is how does this relate to our individual lives? The statement, a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for, is true. And that's what I found at driving stick shift, is that I was comfortable driving an automatic car. I was comfortable driving a car that only had 2 pedals and was easy to drive. And so when my parents put me into a stick shift car, put me out of my harbor, out of my comfort zone, I thought that I was being put upon. It was something that was done to me deliberately to make my life harder. But of course, that wasn't the case. My parents put me into a stick shift car to teach me something I otherwise would not have learned. The skills that I learned, I still have today, and I can drive a stick shift car. But the reality is that this is something that we all experience in our lives. Whether or not you know how to drive a stick shift car, there are all things in our lives that we are not comfortable doing. We have to leave our harbor. We have to leave our comfort zone in order to experience those things and to progress as individuals. But this brings me to my second point, which is that this same principle applies from a societal context. In 1961, President Kennedy promised to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. At that time, Americans had spent a grand total of 15 minutes in space. Space was unfamiliar, far away, and deadly. Nevertheless, in JFK's own words, quote, "There are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction," end quote. Kennedy knew that that seminal speech was going to have to change something in the minds of the American people, something to change their perspective away from fear of the unknown and staying in the harbor to exploring the unknown and to going where no man had gone before. Because he was successful in that seminal speech, Kennedy was able to push the American people to do what had never been done before and land a man on the moon in 1969. Societies only progress just like individuals when they step outside of their comfort zones. But this brings me to my third and final point, which is that this same principle rings true in our relationship with God. In the Bible, we read of the story of Job. Now, Job was a man that God and the devil had a quarrel over. The devil said that if God took away everything that Job had, then Job would deny that God was real. And God said, no, that's not going to happen. So he systematically took away everything that Job had. At the end of it all, Job's friend turned to him and asked, "Why don't you just curse God and die?" And Job said, no, because even though he was going through the most demanding trials he had ever gone through in his life, he still knew that he could rely on God for help. This is ultimately the situation that we sometimes find ourselves in. We can push past our comfort zones, we can do challenging things, but there will be times in our lives when we won't be able to escape the harbor. And those are the times when, just like Job, we have to rely on God's help. In this speech, we've talked about 3 different things. We've talked about the principle that a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. First, in our individual lives, that stepping out of our comfort zones, whether that be driving stick shift or anything else in your individual lives, pushes us to progression. Second, we talked that societies follow this exact same guiding principle. And finally, that even when we cannot escape our harbor, even in the times in our lives when our trials are too difficult for us to overcome by ourselves, that's when we have to lean on the Lord for support. John 16:33 says, "In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." Thank you.